It's going to be very hard to ignore.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, that's right. I mean, you should be able to stop it because effectively, yes, because these are things.
Yeah, I think
At least it's not on the same screen, so I can. I'm not sure my side profile is my best look. Wow.
We might have to just.
do you have it today?
Yes. No, I was so which is it's supposed to be centralized, or I think it's centralized too.
Are you all right?
Yeah.
Now that I need to go
So good morning everyone, and welcome to day 2. We're broadcasting live, please do not swear. So today we've got some more fabulous papers. We'll start with a 2-paper session, then we'll have a quick break for tea and coffee, it being a Sunday morning. This session starts with Helen Deeming, whose work will be familiar to most, if not all of us, from her recent Musica Britannica volume, collecting together a whole new variety of previously unknown fabulous collection. She's also, we're waiting for what's the next few weeks, the new book's going to come out, co-edited with Liz, relating to manuscript. Tell us what the title is.
Manuscripts and Medieval Song.
Manuscripts and Medieval Song with Cambridge University Press. And we know, I'm sure that she works at Royal Holloway. And so we're very excited that she's going to present to us on this subject today.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Lisa. And you do all need to be in sight of one of the iPads, because I'm going to be showing some things on the screen and asking you to look at other things on the tablet in front of you simultaneously. And it'll all be very seamless, I'm sure. Okay. So my paper today considers 3 Latin songs employing the sequence form, and I want to start out by addressing a question that Meg raised in discussion yesterday to do with the sequence and genre. The distinctive sequence form, that is paired verticals or couplets sung to repeated music to form an AABBCC pattern in its simplest manifestations, though it has to be said it seemed to permit quite a high degree of variation from that basic structure, was typically employed by chants that fulfilled the liturgical function of sequences, that is to say, proper chants sung after the Alleluia at Mass. However, the same or similar musico-poetic structures were also employed in other kinds of song, and clearly the vernacular lay is related to this structure. And equally, there are plentiful examples of songs that are found sometimes within a liturgical manuscript context and sometimes outside it. So consequently, I hesitate to classify as sequences all songs that make use of this form, because I think it's helpful to maintain a distinction between the liturgical function and the musical structure. The 3 songs in honour of English and universal saints that I'm considering today are all preserved uniquely in musical miscellanies rather than in liturgical collections, which leaves the question of whether or not they ever had a liturgical function unanswerable. They form part of the repertory of songs that I edited for Musica Britannica recently, which consisted almost entirely of songs found among diverse non-musical materials in miscellany manuscripts. Sequence forms constituted the majority of the songs found in this repertory, some having known concordances in liturgical manuscripts, and others, like these 3, being unique to non-liturgical sources. While within the sequence form, certain particular poetic patterns were especially popular, and 2 of the 3 songs I'm discussing today share one of those most pervasive types. Their musical constructions are, in most cases, more complicated and less regular than the supposed standard pattern AABBCC. They frequently include some versicles that are not repeated, others that recur later in the song rather than immediately, and some that are heard more than twice. So just to introduce the... Oh. Oh. What did I press to get to the next one, James? That one. Oh, there we are. Thank you.
Bizarre.
Was it the left-hand side or the right of the bar? Or does it not matter?
The left-hand side, I think.
Left-hand corner. Okay, thank you. So just to introduce these three pieces. Okay. Recitemus per Heckfesta celebrates the healing miracles of St. Kuneberger and lists in exhaustive and sometimes gruesome detail the hideous ailments which the saint had cured. Dulci Voce Mente Munda commemorates the elevation of Gregory to the papacy, describing the saint's initial reluctance to accept the office. And Ante Thronum Regentis Omnia recounts St. Thomas's reception in heaven, leaving ambiguous, as I will discuss, whether St. Thomas the Apostle or St. Thomas Becket is meant. What I have to say today is really only a loose collection of selected points of notational, musical and textual interest about these pieces, and really just a snippet of what I might say about them. But I hope they will draw attention to some broader matters to do with musical style and judgments, communication and transmission, and the concepts of ambiguity and variability in the specific context of written documents of music. Oh no, I pressed the wrong thing again. So to start with Recitemus per Heckfesta, I think many of you will recognise the melody, shown the opening of it shown here, as a contrafactum of the very famous Laudes Crucis Atulamus sequence, which is well known because it was a later contrafactum of it. Lauda Zion Salvatorem was one of only 4 sequences that survived the culling of sequences from the liturgy in the 16th century. Now I'd like you to invite you here to look on the iPads at this piece, of which there are 3 images, folios 68 recto, 68 verso, and 69 recto. If you'd like to look first, please, at the first one of those. Right, so there is a real problem here in this piece with the distinction between C and F clefs, some of which appear to have been modified later. There are also some additional clefs added in a later hand, and also the custodes at the ends of the lines appear to have been added later, and both of these seem geared towards clearing up some of the ambiguity of the original clefs, although at times these added signs are contradictory. I'd like to invite you to look at verse 4, which begins towards the end of the 3rd staff of music on that page. There we have the first added clef, written in an F clef written in a new hand. And this modifies the music as originally written down by a 5th. The added clef is then reinforced by the clef at the start of the next line, which I think was once a C and appears to have been modified or attempted to be modified to try and turn it into an F. The effect of all this, as shown up here on the screen, is the music as originally written starts on a D, and as modified starts a 5th lower on a G. And because I'm feeling a bit croaky this morning, I'm just going to play those rather than sing them. The music as originally written goes like this. And as modified goes like this. I find it quite difficult to adjudicate between those two in purely musical terms. I don't feel that one is inherently more probable than the other. Whilst the modified version concludes the verse on the final, G, like the previous verses, it is not unheard of to have cadences on the 5th, partway through the song, and the other versions of Laudes Crucis, of the Laudes Crucis family of melodies, do have some verses similar to that ending on D cadences. But in this particular case, we can look at 2 other verses in Recitemus per Heckfesta, which have similar melodic content. Verse 6 is the first of these. This is the verse beginning eius ad confusionem, and I'm sorry, I don't have the image in front of me, so I can't point you to it, but it should be just a little bit further down the page, the same page.
End of the 5th line.
Thank you. Now here the clef is ambiguous, as it collides with a long vertical line down through the staff, which might belong to the clef or might just be a line to signify the start of a verse. It's not quite clear. So we could read it either as C or as F. If it's read as C, the verse is almost identical to the originally written verse 4. But if the clef is read as F, the verse is very similar to the modified verse 4. So it doesn't really help us very much. But a further verse, verse 8, beginning huius prece on the penultimate staff of that page, is again melodically very similar. And in this case, the clef is a bit less ambiguous. Consequently, I think it's fairly clear that that one starts on G. Whether this verse helps to decide the case for the two previous verses retrospectively is not clear to me. It seems likely, perhaps on one level, that the three verses would be the same, but it's also not impossible to have verses at the two different pitch levels coexisting within the same song. It doesn't seem entirely out of the question. Let's look at another example to explore these issues a bit further. Verse 5, which begins with the word mulier at the end of the fourth staff. A C clef is given there. But if it's read with that C clef, this extends the range extremely high, as shown on the slide here. And for various other reasons to do with the intervals at that pitch, I find it melodically unsatisfactory at that higher pitch. And the proposed reconstruction that takes it down a fifth seems better. So that is to say, if we read that C clef as an F clef. Verse 7, which begins ab hac verme, 2 lines further down. This is another one of these ambiguous clefs that could be either, but it's a little bit similar to verse 5 that we've just seen, in that the higher reading, if it's read as a C clef, the line goes quite unusually high and has similar sorts of problems of intervals as we had in verse 5. If we read that as an F clef, and therefore verse 7 at the lower pitch, it happens therefore to be pretty much identical to verse 3. So that would take verse 7 to be a partner to verse 3. Although, as with the previous example, I wouldn't use that alone as evidence for suggesting that verse 7 should be read at the lower pitch. And one possible explanation that occurred to me for this sort of confusion in the cases of verse 5 and verse 7 is that what the scribe is doing there is writing F clefs, but avoiding a long descender for the downstroke of the F, because they come on the bottom line of the stave, and the descender would therefore start interfering with the text. Now, I think if you look at those two cases, verse 5 and verse 7, on the image, you'll see what I mean. Perhaps the scribe is just trying to avoid having that descender collide with the text. Another example, over the page break, if you look at the very end of the page there, you'll see the kustos, just take a note of the kustos at the top of the page, and then please switch to the next image, 68 verso. Now, according to the kustos, the verse that begins on the next folio, on the 68 verso, should begin with a G. So that means that that clef at the top of 68 verso should be read as an F if we're going by the evidence of the kustos at the end of the previous page. But if we read that as an F starting on G, that makes the cadence at the end of this verse 9 very unlikely. I'll just play the cadence. If we followed that through, reading that as an F clef, we get to a cadence at the very end of verse 9 as, which I think sounds lovely to our tonal ears, but it doesn't seem to me to work at all. that sort of almost dominant seventh feel to it doesn't seem quite right, with the semitone below the final. The clefs, as one continues through this verse, don't help very much. If you look at the one at the start of the first line there on 68 verso, I think if you can zoom in on the iPads, you can see that I think it did once have a descender, but that's been scraped out. So that suggests it was once an F clef, and somebody's tried to change it into a C clef by scraping out the descender. And the clef on the second line is another one of these ambiguous ones, which could really be either. Having said that, as the verse continues, it's quite a long verse, and we have multiple clefs and multiple custodes as we go through it, and they do seem to be favouring that F clef reading. So there are multiple pieces of scribal evidence there that do suggest that that lower version, the reading suggested by the custos and subsequent clefs, is indeed what is meant, which is surprising, I think, and problematic. Now, for reasons of time, I'm just going to skip over the next example, but similar problems beset verse 11. And in fact, I think the answer to the questions in that verse are that there are some clefs entirely missing. What can we draw from these notational enigmas in Recitamus per hec festa? It seems to me that a subsequent musician has recognised a problem in the notation of the music and has attempted to modify the copy in numerous places so as to make it usable. However, the attempt has not been wholly successful. Or has it? I think I'll just leave that hanging. What kind of original writing or copying scenario might we envisage that led to these problems in the first place? Was our first scribe copying from another written source but not paying attention to the clefs? Or miscopying C's as F's, or vice versa? Was he writing this down from memory, or perhaps was he even composing it as he wrote? This is a unique copy, so we can't know. Perhaps, as in this case, the source melody or the melodic family to which it belongs was so familiar, so well known, he didn't feel it necessary to take much care over the clefs. And this last possibility strikes me as particularly interesting because it would seem to point to a musical communication situation that relied partly on writing and partly on memory, as surely many did in the Middle Ages, but in quite a specific and curious way that I don't think has been commented on before. In this reading, in this analysis of it, this scribe's notation in some ways becomes like pre-staff notation, reminding the reader of musical shape and contour, and helping to a certain extent with the correspondence of notes to syllables, but being under prescriptive with regards to specific pitches. Now, moving on to Dulci voce mente mundra, I'm afraid this is the end of the images on the iPad, so you don't need to look at these anymore. I apologise, I haven't got an image of this one. This is from British Library manuscript Sloane 1580, and which is very casually written indeed, and this song in particular has suffered some very severe presentation problems. It looks to me as if some of the stave lines have been drawn or redrawn after the notes were written in, and that hasn't been done particularly carefully, which explains why there are lots of moments in the song where the pitches appear to be out by a tone. I think it's to do with the stave lines having got in the wrong places. There is one short passage in this song that has a clef problem similar to those in Recitamus per hec festa. And it's in this verse here. Now, a new clef at the point marked with the red arrow appears to be a C clef. And if read as a C clef, we end up with that lower reading. The music has written the lower notes on the stave there. Reading the notes in this way, however, leads to the phrase ending on a low B, which seems incredibly unlikely, and with the entire compass of the phrase spanning an octave and a sixth, which is very out of keeping with this song and with the songs generally. My proposed reconstruction suggests that that C clef ought to have been a G clef, which would put the whole of that final phrase up a fifth. It leads to a less exaggerated span for the phrase and also preserves the melodic pattern here. So we've got this pattern of and then it continues that pattern by going up and forth and then coming down sequentially. Another part of my proposition here is that all of the notes from legat to the end are also misplaced in relation to the stave lines by a pitch, which is why you can see there that the proposed reconstruction is a sixth higher rather than a fifth for that final phrase. So I'm proposing two failures, if you like, of the notation. But this example, like the ones from Recitamus per hec festa, draw attention to wider questions, I think, of adjudication on the grounds of musical sense in these songs. I couldn't agree more with Meg's assessment yesterday that we still need to improve our analytical tools for handling medieval English music in nuanced ways. And repertories such as this group of songs that fall outside the mainstream even of their own time and lack a theoretical underpinning or a body of pieces with multiple concordances to compare, are even more difficult to assess in this way. Though traditional editing requires us to make these decisions, on many occasions when I was preparing my Musica Britannica volume, I found myself genuinely unable to decide between two different musical possibilities. And I even had the sense sometimes that the scribes were quite content to leave them open-ended. But I raise here the question of whether it is possible or even desirable for musicology to generate a more rigorous approach to this sort of dilemma, and whether the new possibilities for flexible editing that are opened up by digital resources could be a way forward without evading our scholarly responsibilities to understand the music as fully as we can. Oh. Moving on then to my third and final example, Ante Thronum Regentis Omnia, which is shown here on folio 13 recto of the infamous manuscript Harley 978, which includes Sumerisi Kumanin, among other things. This song, which is written by a different notator than those in the rest of the manuscript, uses a notation that is capable of rhythmic interpretation, with the virgae and puncta being used as equivalent, as equating to longae and breves. Now, I don't think I'm going to have to work very hard to persuade you of this, particularly those of you who look at it with slightly later eyes. But if we look at a phrase like, for example, the one that begins here and goes on here, you can see the regular alternation of virga and punctum seems very naturally to turn itself into a rhythmic phrase. At that point, another similar phrase here with only a few ligatures in it. Dum, 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 dum. Oh, I didn't get that quite right. Dum, dum. Anyway, if you look through the whole song, there are enough of those passages that seem very clearly to lend themselves to a mensural interpretation. The ligatures, if the ligatures are treated according to equipolentia, so that is to say they occupy the space of either a long or a breve, depending on where they fall in that pattern, and the vertical lines that are mid-stanza, so the single verticals like here, are treated not as measured rests, but just as breath marks, which is quite common in early mensural chansons, for example, a very distinct mensural character to the song emerges. Now, plenty of other songs in this repertory make use of both the virga and the punctum, as Sam was mentioning in her paper yesterday, but this is the only one in all 115 that can be read as mensural throughout, and is, I think, entirely consistent. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the two-part song Edi Beu Thu Hevne Quena, which Harrison rendered in a rhythmic edition. But close examination both of the source of that song and indeed of Harrison's own commentary on it reveals that in order to make that editorial rhythm, he had to reverse the actual notational forms in an astonishing number, something like a third of all instances. Now, what I think, this is a tangent, but what I think Edi Beu Thu may tell us is that scribes beginning to be affected by rhythmic uses of the old note forms, but not yet using them in a very consistent and thoroughgoing fashion. And in some cases, I think we can see evidence of them starting to use virga and punctum in relation to verbal stress and accent, but again, not consistently. Now, in terms of the text of this song, as I've mentioned already, it's not absolutely clear which St. Thomas is the subject of Ante Thronum. Dennis Stevens included this piece in a list of pieces in honour of St. Thomas Becket, but it seems to me that certain phrases in the text seem more appropriate to St. Thomas the Apostle, particularly the one that I've highlighted on this slide here, mentioning Christ's wound and Thomas's desire in relation to it. Now, I have to admit to finding this phrase quite difficult to construe, but it does seem to me to echo the passage in John 20, verse 24, where Thomas expresses his desire to see Christ and to touch his wound before he will believe, and then Christ appears and grants Thomas his wish. At the same time, the emphasis on martyrdom and Thomas's blood in these later stanzas, highlighted here, seem more likely to be associated with the Canterbury martyr, especially in a song written in 13th century England, and it may be relevant that this manuscript includes other materials relating to St. Thomas Becket. It seems possible to me that the poet deliberately leaves this ambiguous, perhaps wishing to draw the two saints into meaningful association. If so, it would not be the only textual ambiguity in the poem. John Stevens wrote of this poem The quasi-Baroque splendour of the imagery does nothing to clarify the plain sense, which I think just about encapsulates it. The Gleber Felix referred to here is presumably Thomas's body, now enjoying heavenly bliss. But equally, this verse seems to evoke the idea of an ornamented tomb, perhaps Thomas's shrine in Canterbury. And if so, the mention of its new light, Nova Luce, could, as Rebecca Balzer has suggested, refer to the newly refurbished shrine that was created at the translation of the saint's relics in 1220, his first Jubilee year. And it's tempting to believe that such an occasion could have provided the impetus for the composition of this song. Now, this song is especially notable for this kind of textual ambiguity, but again, it's not the only one in which such issues occur. And just as musical editing forces us to commit to musical judgments, the act of translation compels us to take a particular stance on meaning. But it seems to me that perhaps the first poets and readers and singers and audiences were more content than we are to leave some of these questions unresolved, to be contemplated upon, perhaps. Now, just to finish off, the oddities of the text and the curiosity of the unique mensural notation come together in an especially interesting phrase found in verse 1b that I've highlighted here. Organizat triplex hierarchia, the triple hierarchy, sings polyphony. Now, there is plenty of musical imagery in texts relating to Beckett. For example, there's a frequent wordplay on the words cantare and cantuarie, for example. But this is the only mention of polyphonic vocabulary in a piece for Beckett that I know about. And if anyone has any other examples, I'd love to hear about them. What I find particularly tantalizing about this phrase is the fact that Ante thronum regentis omnia is the only non-polyphonic example of mensural notation found in 13th century English sources, and indeed even in continental sources before the end of the century. Now, entering into the realm of wild speculation, therefore, I wonder whether this song has or had a polyphonic ancestor that could help to explain why it came to be notated in this way that is otherwise unattested in monophonic song. I have to admit to having done some preliminary searching for possible polyphonic connections and having turned nothing up so far. There are, of course, polyphonic pieces in honour of Beckett, including some well-known motets and conductus from both English and continental sources, and some 15th century carols. But neither among these, nor among the corpus of polyphonic sequences, are there any pieces that relate musically to this one. And I have not even uncovered any pieces that have the same poetic structure, so that could be candidates for contrafacta. But absence of evidence is not proof against this possibility, and it would certainly fit with what we know of the circulation of related pieces on the continent to find songs that ultimately derived from a polyphonic origin continuing to employ mensural notation even when transmitted in monophonic form. So what I've attempted to show through these disparate examples then is a complex of related enigmas to do with notation and transmission, and with musical and textual style, how we judge these, and how we handle the variability and ambiguity that seems in some cases to have been an accepted part of the song-making culture of 12th and 13th century England. For me, they highlight just how far we still have to go in developing robust analytical tools for handling this music and sophisticated modes of interpretation for us contextualizing it within the social worlds it once inhabited. It's about facing the music, but it's also about facing up to what the musical documents really have to tell us. Thank you.
Fabulous paper, thank you. And I'm sure there'll be questions. I just want to say that idea of the two Thomases coexisting in the same poem is interesting, and given that you're already thinking that maybe there was a polyphonic ancestor, it's worth noting that Thomas Gamer Cantuarie is paired with Thomas of Becket and Dover paired in that late 13th century motet in a way that would be perhaps similar.
Yeah.
There are questions, I'm sure.
Helen, I love that. Great paper, thank you. I love this thing about the mentioning notated song and a possible polyphonic ancestor. And I just wanted to say that this fits very neatly with some work I've been doing on Trubert Manuscript O, which is Bibliothèque Nationale 806. And after doing a countable ligatures, there are 4 songs which have weird mensural ligatures that don't appear anywhere else in the manuscript. And funnily enough, these are the 4 songs that have motet concordances. And all the other songs in the manuscript have supposedly menstrually looking notation. So they have virga and puncte, but they're not in any kind of regular, most of them aren't in any kind of regular alteration. These songs are, and they've got special kind of, so they use ligatures that differentiate themselves according to propriety and perfection, two reeds and so on. And I think that they've probably got this notation, the notation that actually works, they probably got from Motet composers.
Yeah.
So just to say that there's a very good continental, I guess, parallel to
Yeah.
what you're suggesting.
Thank you very much. That's exactly the sort of thing I had in mind when I was talking about this. These and this sort of strange and elusive idea of the monophonic motet, which Mark Everest has talked about as well. We see it there, and we also see it in these funny pieces that are called conductus prosily, where the polyphonic cauda of a conductus is later texted and becomes a song in its own right. And again, that it tends to preserve its rhythmic notation even once it's taken out of the polyphonic context. So those are the sorts of relationships I'm looking at. But thank you very much for that example.
Thank you. No, yes, lovely paper. Lots in there to chew on. Because I love what your exegesis of this one. The extraction of motet voices has a later English. Slightly later manuscript, Durham C120, has some isolated motetus or triplex parts presented on these all tucked in once. So it could be that there's an ongoing tradition.
Great, thank you.
The other thing that occurred to me is slightly sort of devil's advocate spirit. Your seeming rejection of something that goes out of range. I thought, well, on the one hand, what about Hildegard? And on the other hand, I was thinking of the Masher maze, where it's quite normal, so in the middle of this series of double versicles, for the thing to go way out of the range of the rest of the piece. And also, it's quite common for the final double versicle of the Masher maze to be at a fifth higher than the open one. Same music,
yes,
higher.
yes.
I wonder whether there's any link there.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you for reminding me of that. Yes, that phenomenon where the music of the first verse comes back but transposed up a fifth.
Yeah.
That is very interesting. I'll look into that further.
The overall range of some of those notes is enormous.
Yeah.
And,
yeah.
So I wouldn't want to project it only on those parts. I would
No.
make a very good case for it. I would just want to soft pedal on saying rejecting it because it
only on those grounds. Yes, I think it needs to be backed up with other evidence as well. But I was conscious as I was going through those examples very quickly and not being able to say everything quite that I wanted to fit in. Some of my problems that have to do with the intervallic structure when it's transposed, of course, could be resolved if the singer's supplied what we might call accidentals ad lib. So that is to say, the fact that it's transposed up a fifth makes some things that were tones into semitones need not necessarily have been a problem in the singing of it. So yes, I think I need to build up multiple pieces of evidence to reject certain readings and prefer others, but it's a bit of a mire still.
First of all, I thank you for the wonderful paper. I'm sure you've already thought about this, but I thought just point out this particular text seems more written for Thomas the Apostle because it talks about seeing the wounds of Christ and what this gives Thomas. Also, I had a question about the first image.
Mm-hmm.
If you go to the sixth verse, and this is I think the sixth stave as well.
It's me, yeah, but I might have to come and look at it.
There's a text substitution. And I was wondering if because it was first written in the margin, it seems, and then actually added into the text. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
Yes, no, I actually was going to mention that and then cut it out of the paper for reasons of time. But yes, you can see, I think you can make out what's written in the margin is the text that's been supplied there.
Yeah.
I have no way of knowing what the text was underneath there, but it's a tricky corner in terms of translation. So I'm not surprised that that was a bit of text that caused the original scribe some problems. Yeah, I can't tell you what the text was underneath that, why that substitution was made, but it's not the only example.
Okay.
Can I ask a related question? Which is, how many people do you think are involved in that page? Because, I mean, towards the end of the third line, there's that F clef.
Yeah.
Is it F clef?
Yeah.
Which looks quite unlike anything else.
Yeah.
There's all kinds of people have been messing around with it over the years.
It's very strange. Yes, I think you're right. Possibly the people who added those clefs are not the same people who added the custodes, or who tried to modify some of the other clefs. I think it's very likely that maybe it's a little bit of the manuscript context helps us here, because this is a book that is thought to have belonged to the schoolmaster at Lanthony Priory, and there are various texts that are drafted in plummet and then rewritten in ink, and there seems to be evidence of writing practice. So it looks like the sort of book that had practical use involving lots of different people over a considerable period of time. So perhaps that explains. And one of the other musical pieces in the manuscript is one of these texts that was written multiple times, or drafted multiple times earlier in the manuscript and then written in ink later. So there seems to be some fiddling around with the musical content going on here.
Are those pin trials at the top, or is there something that's aside from it?
I think this is another example of lots of places we see in the manuscript where texts have been drafted and then scraped out, or actually I don't think this one is scraped, I think it's just faded. But it looks like the parchment has been used multiple times for different things as the book was put together.
I think we're going to have to draw questions to a close. I'm sure we could all ask lots of questions. It's a fabulous paper.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Objecting from that one. Yes, I think. Did you just yes.
Yeah.
Shall I let you find it? I won't fiddle. Try very hard not to look at myself at the same time as doing this, but it's very awkward. So. Just be blinking. Yeah, I'll just yeah. So let me introduce Louise McInnes. I know Louise and her work very well because she was a student here at Huddersfield, right through PhD, and her PhD focused on late medieval carols from England, looking at all sorts of different aspects of them relating to genre and structure and performance. She was lecturing here. And that has been snatched away by a full-time position at University of Sheffield, where she's a placement officer for the Faculty of Arts and Humanities, and also maintains some relationship with the music department also. Now that Sheffield have sensibly appointed a medievalist back into their staff with Tim Shepard's appointment, which is great. And there's also a publication coming out in Early Music Performer this year.
Yes.
Yes, this year. So let's welcome Louise.
Good morning. It's very hard to follow Helen's wonderful paper, but I shall do my best. So some of you may have heard me talk about the late medieval English carols at numerous conferences over the last few years. I'm hoping I didn't bore you to tears with them all. I've discussed them in relation to their perceptions of women in the Middle Ages, how they're used as a political tool, how they're wrongly supposed as a genre merely for the amusement of educated clerics, and how they convey a sense of popular song. Today, however, I'd like to share with you some of the reasons why my research into this genre was necessary, why the carol as a form has been somewhat neglected, and examine how looking at it in new ways can reveal it to be so much more than previously suggested. The late medieval carol is easily distinguished by its repetitive verse burden structures, I'm sure you will know, and is abundant in a wealth of sources, both with and without musical notation. It's an important musical form that, in terms of detailed, published academic research, has been greatly neglected for many years. Most of the main studies of the genre were undertaken in the middle of the 20th century by literary specialist Richard Leighton Green and musicologist John Stevens. The reason for this gap is certainly not due to saturation of research in this area, as there's still much to learn about the importance of this musical form and its diverse uses in medieval life, but more likely a combination of factors, some of which I'd like to discuss with you today. I could go on for a very long time, so I've just had to pick a few small things out to discuss. Firstly, I'd like to address the tendency of musicologists and literary specialists to discuss the carol in isolation from other genres. And often it's rather an afterthought. There are these wonderful musical pieces, oh, and there were carols. Somebody else has talked about that somewhere else. You know, they don't tend to really put them into much discussion. I wonder, firstly, whether this is due to the fact that they're an indigenous form that are not found in continental sources and as wrongly seen as just an amusement for educated clerics, where in fact they permeate all levels of society and music. And they're perceived, therefore, as somewhat disconnected in some way from other musical genres. However, with the exception of the Trinity role, carols are actually always found placed amongst other musical and literary genres in extant manuscripts of the 15th century, and should therefore be discussed in conjunction with these forms in order to better understand them, not only in a social context, but in terms of musical content. If we look at this table, if I can get this to work, if you look at this table, you can see the main musically notated manuscripts I'm sure a lot of you are very familiar with. And all the different forms of music that the carols are sat alongside. Bearing in mind this is only musically notated manuscripts, this is not looking at the non-notated musical carols, non-notated carols. It's hard to get your head around that every time I say it. The non-notated carols which appear amongst lots of different manuscripts and with lots of different types of musical genres. That gives you a little overview. So in order to further understand the carol, a new approach is needed, starting with an examination of it in relation to these other genres. As an example of this, I could pick many examples, but I don't have time. I'm going to briefly look at British Additional 5665, also known as the Ritson manuscript, and the relationship between the carol and the hymn. The connection between these two forms is an excellent example not only of the carol sitting alongside another genre within a manuscript, but also of it drawing from and engaging with other sources. We actually find that a total of 60 carols that exist contain lines borrowed from hymns. The Ritson manuscript, dating from the late 15th century and most probably from Exeter, is one of only two 15th century English sources that contain polyphonic hymns, one of these being O Lux Beata Trinitas, which you should see here, which is a hymn for two voices. Although this hymn is not quoted in any of the carols within the Ritson manuscript itself, it is quoted in two extant carols, which is found within three manuscripts: To Bless God Bring Us All in Some, from Balliol College 354, and English Poetry E1, and Make We Joy Now in This Feast, from Selden B26 and English Poetry E1 again. These carols use the first line of the hymn in different ways in the text. The carol To Bless God Bring Us All in Some actually uses Latin lines from 6 different hymns for the second line of the burden and the last line of each stanza. The first line of this particular hymn is found at the end of stanza 4 in the version from Balliol College 354, and we can see this version here. Unfortunately, there's no surviving musical notation for this carol in order to compare the music of the hymn and the music of the carol. The carol Make Me Joy, however, does survive with musical notation, although there seems to be no obvious relationship between the two melodies. It uses Latin lines from 10 hymns this time as the second line of its burden and as the first and last lines of each verse. The hymn is not placed next to the carols in the Ritson manuscript, but between a Marian antiphon and an antiphon. The carols in Ritson are actually placed near the beginning of the manuscript, and the initial construction of it can be seen here. So I've not included all the layers in between. These are the layers that contain carols within the Ritson manuscript. So although we can observe large sort of sections of carols, so we've got 31 carols, 8 carols, 5 carols. Oh, I've lost my place there. Yeah, I got carried away with myself. Looking at my own slides. So although we can observe large selections of carols here, they are still interspersed with other forms. Ritson is compiled in a number of layers, layer 1 the earliest consisting of all 44 carols and 6 other items such as antiphons and 3 settings of the Nicene matter. The first layer is believed to have been started around 1460, with the final layers completed around 1500. The inclusion of material from layer 5 around the carols, the latest layer, would suggest their continuing popularity and use around that later period. So the other music from layer 1 consists of a monophonic vernacular song, 2 3-voice Nicene matters, 2 3-voice Marian antiphons, and a 3-voice textless fragment. So here we see the carol then, not isolated from other musical genres at all, but surrounded by them physically and containing borrowed material from other forms within them. which is elements of which we see across the carol genre in forms of both textual and musical borrowing from other sources, particularly liturgical elements of text and music are found within them. The 15th century scribes and compilers of these manuscripts clearly saw them as worthy enough to sit alongside other liturgical musical forms as well as vernacular song. Therefore, as researchers today, we should do the same. Would you like me to carry on? Okay. Separation and segmentation of the carol genre is also seen in the tendency of researchers to deal with those surviving with musical notation and those without extant notation as separate areas of research, rather than one body of material. We have a large number of non-notated carols, in fact over 500 carol texts that survive from approximately 1360 to 1520. Only 138 survive with music. Therefore, to only focus on these notated carols as musicologists has failed to see the genre in a fuller context. Until Green's landmark study in 1935, published carol research had been minimal. His work, which catalogued the carols and placed them into subject categories, brought the carol text to the fore. His publication, however, was primarily concerned with the text rather than the music, and additionally only included those carols in English or English and Latin. He also completely excludes the Latin carols, classing them instead as Cantilena, subsequently creating yet another way of segmenting the carol genre. It was not until John Stevens' comprehensive Musica Britannica edition of a large selection of the polyphonic and monophonic carols in 1952 that the music was brought to the forefront, and I'm very glad to hear that David's doing something wonderful with that edition. Stevens chose, quite rightly, to include the Latin carols that were excluded by Green on the grounds the musical form is identical to those that were English or macaronic. Indeed, if the Latin carols were included alongside the English and macaronic carols in the 15th century without any clear separation, and they were, there would seem no reason for us to separate them for research purposes today. Stevens' inclusion of the Latin carols in his edition certainly emphasised their musical value, but he did not include, due to the focus of his study, any of the vast corpus of non-notated carols. He does, however, allude to them in his commentary. This edition of carols did not, however, include the 18 carols of the Fairfax manuscript from circa 1500, or the 13th century carols of the 13 carols of the Henry VIII manuscript, due to the difference in style between the carols of this early period and those of the early 16th century. Instead, he produced a separate volume of songs and carols of the Ritson and Fairfax manuscripts in 1975, and had already published an edition of Henry VIII's manuscript in 1962. Thus then saw the creation of yet another way of separating carol into different research categories. This edition, however, does present the carols in a wider context and places them alongside songs from both other manuscripts, thus not treating them so much in isolation as we've seen before. Since Stevens and Green's editions, scholars have seemed reluctant to publish on the carols in any great detail. The work, perhaps, I think, was seen as a bit definitive. There's the texts, there's the music, that's it. There seemed to be nothing really substantial that went on after that. Many publications have touched briefly on the carol genre, but none that serve to look at them in a greater historical context or looking at both notated and non-notated carols together. More recent scholars, however, such as Helen, have tackled the genre anew with valuable work in individual carols such as the Agincourt Carol. And David has also discussed the importance of not necessarily the carols themselves, but their extant manuscripts to the mapping of song throughout the 15th century. And I know he has some other work on carols in the pipeline that I'm very excited about. Other scholars too, such as Ruskin, have written briefly on the genre of late, but again, either as notated or non-notated genre, never both. I could go on and on with examples, and I'm sure you don't wish an entire literary review, so I'll stop there. The predisposition to treat the carols either a musical or textual genre, and sometimes also in terms of carols before 1470 and after 1470, serves only to look at the repertoire in a one-dimensional way. All aspects of the repertoire needs to be looked at and seen as equally valuable in order to understand the carol and its place in 15th century society. The need for a multidisciplinary approach is imperative here. Although many carols have no extant music and are more often discussed by literary specialists than musicologists, we cannot say with any certainty they weren't set to music. Indeed, in such a society, oral traditions were strong, and there would have been less of a need for notation. Certainly the monophonic carols, which are found scattered amongst random material in pocketbooks or manuscripts containing little other music, the vast corpus of non-musically notated carols, some of which have instructions accompanying them of what melodies to sing them to, points towards a tradition of oral transmission in the genre as a popular song, something I don't have time to address in detail here. One only has to look at the large non-notated chansonniers, for example, to see the carols are not alone in surviving or being deliberately compiled without notation. The lack of carols composed by so-called famous composers, I use that kind of loosely, has not helped in raising the interest of musicologists, I believe, either, with the exception of one carol from Godley and Selden B26, I Pray You All, that's labelled JD, which musicologists have long clung to the hope that it may be by John Dunstable. I think he's been tweeting us prior to the conference, actually, so perhaps we should have asked him. Could have cleared this matter up for us immediately, couldn't he? There are no famous composers connected with the extant carol repertoire until we reach edition 5465, otherwise known as the Fairfax manuscript. And obviously we then get to the Henry VIII manuscript with Henry himself. We do find a number of familiar names start cropping up there, so Cornish, Davy, Brown, Bannister start to appear. This makes the earlier carols less desirable, I think, as a genre for serious research and places them more in a cabinet of musical curiosity rather than at the forefront of research. The named composers we do have for the early carols are considered provincial due to their location outside of the royal court and their lack of connection with continental sources, and are therefore of less interest to researchers, it would seem, than composers of the royal court. We can see on the slide here, I'm hoping it's big enough, the named carol composers that we do have. Taking a composer-centred approach to researching this genre, and in fact other genres of this period lacking in named composers, is not appropriate or possible. Even those composers that are assigned to works are not necessarily assigned with accuracy. The carol repertoire of the 15th and early 16th centuries is an ideal example of this ambiguity found in attributing authorship in the Middle Ages. Of the approximately 130 extant carols with music, although a large number in terms of extant material for this period, only 25 have attributed authors, the majority of which survived from the early 16th century rather than the 15th century. And of these 25 carols, only a total of 15 separate names are attributed, including the ambiguous attribution of John Dunstable to the JD carol. And because you've listened to me witter on without any really interesting pictures, I have, with very little connection, just included it. I thought you deserved a reward. The Franciscan James Ryman is heralded as the most prolific of carol writers. His carols are mostly found in Cambridge E112 and are actually an ideal example of the uncertainty of assigning authorship in this period. This doubt concerning his authorship exists despite an inscription found halfway through the document that reads, "Here ends the book of songs, which were composed by James Ryman, the brother of the Order of Friars Minor, to the praise of Almighty God and of his most holy mother Mary and all the saints, in the year of our Lord 1492. The inscription does not act as a definitive confirmation, despite what some scholars have written over the years. Ryman, it doesn't give us definitive confirmation that Ryman did in fact compose these carols. The Latin word composite used in the inscription could easily mean compile as well as compose. The likelihood that he was the author is probably high, but by no means certain, particularly as this inscription occurs partway through the manuscript and not at the end, therefore omitting to apply to subsequent 39 other pieces. Whether these compositions still apply to the Ryman inscription is open to debate and a whole other paper. Green gives a really interesting summary of Ryman, which I'm going to share with you. He writes, Ryman is responsible for a quarter of all the extant English carols of a date earlier than 1550. Ryman is to be regarded as a conscientious, rather uninspired Franciscan, engaged in turning religious and profitable matter into vernacular songs in order to appeal to the people. His use of the carol form is doubtless the result of observation of the popularity of the carol at the time he was writing. This quote's really interesting, not only for its strong opinion on the author of this carols, but also of his way of trying to humanise Ryman. He paints this picture of a particularly uninspired Franciscan, composing carols for his fellow friars and their congregations in a very conscientious manner, and drawing on his knowledge of the popularity of the carol at the time. And this underlying attempt to make Ryman a three-dimensional and somewhat dull figure, and to give a narrative to his work is a really good example of our want to create and understand music through an author, no matter how sparse our evidential material may be. Even if we could confirm that Ryman was the author of all 119 carols currently attributed to him, some uncertainty would still remain as to how much of the material was even his own. Borrowing of music and lyrics, as we've seen previously in the Middle Ages, was commonplace, and Ryman may well have worked in collaboration with others. Too much uncertainty exists around the shadowy artistic figures of the medieval period that we like to examine, to actually attempt to build any sort of pictures of the music and lyrics through them. As musicologists researching in an area that's littered with large swathes of missing material, we must try and move away from this sort of composer-centred approach and instead combine another number of other methods in order to understand the genres we study. So moving on, the misconception that carol texts are often only centred upon the nativity does not help the cause of the genre either. And I believe this is perpetuated most probably because the vast majority of notated carols that survive are sacred and often based on Christmas themes. However, whilst predominantly occupied with the sacred, carols, and particularly the non-notated carols, actually open a window into many aspects of medieval society and help us to place the genre in a far clearer social and historical context. The late medieval carols address an abundance of human life, which Green actually first categorised under another number of headings. These are Green's headings. His categorisations, whilst undeniably useful, tend to suggest a sense of finality in defining the carols and are misleading in quite a number of ways. One example is when we start to apply modern methodologies such as gender study to our research. If we start to just look at the representation of women in the carols, he only places 12 carols under the heading Carols of Women, at the bottom right there. However, on closer inspection, this categorisation is clearly far more complex than Green would like us to believe, as within 35 manuscripts, I've actually identified more than 60 carols that discuss women, are in a female voice, have some female narrative, or deal with female saints. All of these are in some way carols of women, and reveal much about the representation of the female in this period, from saintly female to the unfortunate maid, who's usually seduced by an untrustworthy cleric, most often named Jack, which is a worry because that's the name of my daughter's boyfriend, so I'll be keeping an eye on him. The late medieval carol has much to say about women and their place in society, and most importantly, their involvement as creators, participants, and receivers of medieval carols at all different levels of society, something that would be missed if we didn't move on from traditional ways of categorising. Green's categorisation of the political carols, too, is also somewhat narrow and fails to take into account carols for St George and St Thomas Becket, things like that. I just think we need to look in a much greater detail, and is whole other papers. Unfortunately, I don't have time today to discuss all the interesting ways in which we can look at the carols anew. As much as I'd like to, I can only give you a brief overview of some of the ways in which they've been neglected. But hopefully this paper has whetted your appetite a little bit for the possibilities that remain in researching not only this genre, but other music of this period in new ways, combining traditional empirical research with gender study, literary study, and more of an appreciation of music within a wider historical context. In a shameless plug of my completed PhD thesis, I believe that by having examined the carols in these ways, the genre is revealed as far more multifaceted and interesting than has been previously portrayed in the past. As musicologists, rather than sidelining what is perceived perhaps as parochial music in favour of the grander polyphonic musical forms, we should now place greater value on such interesting indigenous musical forms, and indeed other forms of music that can tell us more about 15th century England. Thank you.
Thank you, Louise, very much. I for one am convinced. I think the carol's a wonderful thing. Question?
Yes, as a kind of quirky footnote to your list of carols that have attributions, there's also the credo ascribed to Banchois that quotes Rachel's love Prince of Peace, which David will bounce. But there's a whole chunk of that credo follows the music almost exactly as it's.
Okay. That was really interesting, so maybe I could have a look at and have a little talk with you after about. David maybe would give us some insight.
Not in 2 sentences.
Will we save it for later?
I mean, between them, actually, Andrew and Peter have said in print more or less what there is to say about that. But can I just 2 observations? One, I mean, marvellous that categorisation by Green. You see that basically everything in Green comes from his doctoral thesis at Princeton in like 1928. You know, the book of 1935 is a scissors and paste job from that. But that categorization is there in historical fiction.
It's very much of its
the
time.
77 book is once again, but you know, so much of the work is so good. So much of the transcription is so good. So much of the glossing is so good that it really isn't worth anybody's while to redo the whole thing from scratch. So I'm sure somebody will do sometime soon. But it really isn't. You just have to bear in mind, which is what you're underlining here, and it's quite right, that you know, he just had to try to get some kind of order into the material.
Yeah, and I think it's a product of its
time.
time. I think it's a product of its time, isn't
Absolutely.
it? Really, I mean, we look at it with fresh eyes, with our gender study eyes and things like that, where he did, and I think because he did such a good job, I think that's why people have been reluctant to touch it.
But the thought processes behind even the 77 revision are of 1927, and so that's what. The other thing I did want to say is that it seems to me that Ritson is a lot simpler than you portray it. Ritson is the manuscript that has carols all together, all in a single hand. There are 3 pieces at the end, 3 Nescience Martyr settings that are in the same hand, and I don't know quite what they're about, but everything else is in different hands. But what you get in Ritson is a much purer group of carols without other stuff inside. Whereas in Selden, I mean, Selden's a complete disaster because you know, if something's in strict carol form, it's in the John Stevens book, and if it's in exactly the same style, with exactly the same materials, exactly the same voice ranges, but not in strict carol form, it's in the Andrew Hughes volume. You know, and so that's very complicated.
I think that's another aspect of the carols that's also, I think we think of the carol as this very fixed form that doesn't change, and I think, as you sort of pointed out there, actually it does change and it evolves, you know, throughout the sort of 15th century and keeps up with musical trends, and so there is a lot of interest there as well. It isn't just this verse virgin structure. That's what it does, you know, even in terms of the amount of voices that are used, it grows throughout the 15th century. So I think that's another thing that perhaps people haven't looked at it particularly for either. I think they just think, well, that's it. There's not really much interest in it, but it does grow and develop. Like you say, there's lots of different elements of it in different sources, isn't there?
Yes, I think like so many musical forms, there comes a point at which it distills and becomes fairly fixed for a bit, and that's the stage you see in Ritson. Yeah,
Ritson's interesting. I think because of how it might have been used. I think, but that, again, that's another whole other discussion, isn't it, really?
Perhaps it's a discussion we can continue.
Coffee,
Let's
yes.
thank Louise very much for the paper and the both speakers.